Thank you, Janelle. Earlier this summer, I went with our children's ministry as one of the chaperones as they went to camp. We were to leave on Monday and return on Friday of that week. As I was trying to get my things together before I'd even put them in a suitcase, that Monday morning, early on, I had to decide what I was going to do about something, and here was my dilemma. The little bit of hair that I have is cut very short, and because of that, a little bit of length over the course of the week is, at least to me, noticeable. And so I had this dilemma, because typically I cut my hair on either Saturday or Sunday morning, and then midweek, around Wednesday, I cut it again. So I just cut it this morning, and no one has said anything to me. We'll catch up after the service. Anyway, so my thought was this: if I cut my hair on Saturday or Sunday morning, I leave on Monday, by the time Friday rolls around, it's just going to be out of control. I mean, I'm going to look like Fabio by the end of the week, and it's just... But I didn't want to take clippers with me to have to deal with that, and so I had this idea. What I will do before I leave is to shave my head with a razor, and at that point, by the end of the week, by Friday, it'll be about this length. So I thought that was pretty smart, and so I head to the bathroom that morning. I lather my face up, and I lather my head up, and I shave everything. And so I get a shower, I get out, I get dressed, I go upstairs, and Caroline is in the room, and I'm waiting for her to say something, to notice this. But she doesn't say anything. And so finally I explained to her what I had done, that I had actually shaved my head. And her response was so touching, it was almost fit for a Hallmark card. She said, "Don't make a big deal about it to the other chaperones because you really can't tell." Her point was simple. There's so little hair to begin with, taking it all off really doesn't make any difference. It's a little thing with no real difference. Sometimes a change in the little things doesn't generate much of a difference. But that's not always the case, is it? If, for example, I came in this morning and I had shaved off one of my eyebrows, that would be a big difference, wouldn't it? Sometimes little things create big, consequential differences. I want you to see that principle at work this morning in your Bibles with me. Look with me to Joshua chapter 7. Joshua chapter 7. I hope you brought your Bible with you. If you didn't, I encourage you next time to do so. If you don't have one with you, either scoot near someone that has one or grab a Bible from the pew rack in front of you, because this is true. Nothing I say today is important as what God has said here. Nothing I say today is important as what God has said here. Joshua chapter 7. We're going to get to that in a moment, but let me set the stage for you as to what's going on. Israel has got a lot of stuff now as a nation in the rearview mirror. Their years of slavery in Egypt, the traveling to get to the promised land, the 40 years of wilderness wandering, all of that is behind them. Something else that's behind them is the era of Moses' leadership. He is now dead, and Joshua is the leader of the nation of Israel. His task, very simply, is this: to lead the nation of Israel to go and take possession, finally, of the promised land, of the land of Canaan. There's a problem, though, and the problem is this: the promised land is not vacant. It is inhabited by a slew of different small nations and city-states, pagan nations. And Israel's task is to go and to fight these nations, and with the help of God, get them out and establish this and experience this land being that which God is giving to them. Well, the first enemy, the first nation that they're going to come up against, we read about in chapter 6 of Joshua. And that's the city of Jericho. Jericho is noteworthy because it is a walled, fortified city. Walled, fortified cities are easy to defend, but they are very difficult to attack. And before even giving them the strategy for how to deal with this city, God gave them some very, very specific instructions. In verse 18 of chapter 6, God tells them this: "You keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction." Keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction. They're getting ready in the coming days to go into this city and fight and take possession of it. But there are to be no survivors, whether animal or beast. There's to be no plundered possessions that the Israelites keep as spoils of victory, no treasures that they pick up and keep for themselves. In fact, the only thing that is to be kept is the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron, and that is specifically reserved to be brought into the treasury of the Lord. Everything in Jericho is devoted to one of two things, either to destruction or it's devoted to God. What doesn't go into the treasury of the Lord, that is to be burned. The city of Jericho is to be razed. God was very clear about those instructions. Relative to how they were to approach the city, God was also equally clear. He said that the nation of Israel was to march around the walls, around the city, around the entire perimeter of Jericho one time a day in silence for 6 days. So every day for 6 days, they just quietly march around the city. On the seventh day, they're to do something different. They're to begin by marching 6 times around the city, saying nothing. But on the seventh time, they are to have the priests blow their trumpets, and the people are to shout. Perhaps you remember what happened. God did the miraculous. As they did exactly what God said, He brought the walls of the city down to nothing more than a pile of rubble. They then can go in and assault the city and do exactly what God had said. God had given very clear instructions, and they did exactly what God had said, and He gave the victory to them, an amazing, miraculous victory. The nation of Israel did exactly what God said, except for this one guy. His name was Achan. And in verse 20 of chapter 7, we read what Achan did. Achan, as he's going in with Israel's armies, he sees some things that he decides not to destroy or to put into the temple of the Lord. The first thing that he does is to see a cloak that he decides, it's a shame for that to be burned. It's beautiful, probably costs a lot of money. I'll keep that for myself. He also kept 200 shekels, or about 80 ounces of silver. 50 shekels in this bar of gold, that's about 50 ounces or 20 ounces of gold that he was able to keep, or did keep, for himself. Dug a little hole underneath his tent to secure and to hide them, and that's what he did. Now, here's the deal. No one apart from Achan and God know what Achan has done. Joshua doesn't know. The leaders of the nation collectively do not know. Perhaps even Achan's own family has no idea what he has done. Well, the next city that Israel is to assault is the city of Ai. And as chapter 7 begins, in verse 2, Joshua, we're told, sent men from Jericho to Ai. These were spies. He tells them in verse 7, go up and spy out the land. And the men went up and spied out Ai. That's prudent. That makes sense. If you're getting ready to fight an enemy, it stands to reason that you want to know who and what you're dealing with. How many people do they have? How large is their army? What type of defenses? What type of weaponry might they have? And so we're told that they did what Joshua said, and they returned in verse 3 and said to Joshua, do not have all the people go up. Rather, let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and attack Ai. Don't make the people toil up there, for they are few. It's pretty clear what they're saying to Joshua. This is just a piddly little place. And it's just a small city, and there are so comparatively few people. We don't need the entire nation. We don't need the whole army 2,000 or 3,000 is more, amazingly more than enough to be able to defeat them. And so hearing that very confident report, that's what Joshua does. He dispatches 3,000 soldiers to go and attack Ai. Well, they did so, but things do not unfold as expected. Verse 4 of chapter 7 says, about 3,000 men went up from there, from the people, and they attacked Ai. And what happens? They wind up fleeing before the men of Ai. The men of Ai killed about 36 of their men and chased them before the gate as far as Cherubim and struck them at the descent. This isn't how this was supposed to go. 3,000 soldiers is way more than enough to defeat this little tiny town of Ai. Yet when they actually launch the assault, the residents of Ai fight back ferociously. They kill 36 Israelis. And the rest of them, they send running for their lives. They are scared to death. When news of what has occurred on the front reaches Joshua, we're told in verse 6 that he tore his clothes. That's the sign of his grief, of his despondency. And then we're told that he fell to the earth on his face before the ark of the Lord until the evening. The ark of the Lord symbolizing the presence of God before the people. Joshua is just enormously discouraged, despondent, vexed. He comes before the ark, before the presence of God, and he just falls on his face. It seems that for a time he doesn't say anything until finally in verse 7 he says, "Alas, O Lord God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all?" That's him saying this, God, why is it that you even brought us out of Egypt in the first place? To give us into the hands of the Amorites, these pagan people, to destroy us. I wish that we had been content to dwell in the land on the other side of the Jordan. He said, I wish we could have been happy living in slavery back in Egypt. And then he says in verse 9, in terms of consequence, God, I want you to know what this is going to do. The rest of the inhabitants of Canaan, they're going to hear about this, and they're going to come and surround us and cut your name off from the earth. We are, after all, your people. News of this colossal defeat is going to spread. They're going to surround us, subdue us, and kill us. Your people will cease to exist on the earth. And then he finishes with this question, and what will that do for your great name? What's that going to say about you? He's just being candid to God. Well, God is equal in his candor in dealing with Joshua. He starts and gives his response in verse 10. He tells him to get up. Why have you fallen on your face? Notice what verse 11 says. God says, this is not a problem of military strategy. The problem has nothing to do with weapons and armament. This is the problem. Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings. Therefore, which is to say, that's why the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. Joshua, this isn't a military problem. This is a spiritual problem. Israel has sinned. Well, you're probably, if you've been around church or the Bible long enough, aware of what happens next. God reveals to Joshua the guilty party. Joshua goes to Achan's tent where his family is, and he says, tell me what you've done. And Achan, seemingly without berating, confesses to what he's done. He said there was this beautiful cloak, and I hated for it to be burned. It was going to be lost anyway, so I decided I could benefit from it, so I kept it. And there was so much gold and silver and other precious metals going in the treasury, I just thought that these 200 shekels of silver and these 50 shekels of gold, that it wouldn't be missed. My family could really use this. That's going to help us as we get set up in the promised land, and so I kept them for myself. Shouldn't have done that, but I kept them for myself. In fact, I hid them. I dug a little hole underneath my tent. In that hole, I buried them and covered them up. Well, the consequences of this act of sin were significant, very significant. And it's not simply that 36 Israelites lost their lives unnecessarily, but Achan and his wife, his children, and even all of their animals are stoned. Every one of them killed, executed. And not simply were they stoned, but then their bodies were burned to further underscore what had taken place. You say, well, Michael, that's interesting. It's kind of a gory ending to a story, but yeah, I heard that. Maybe you're hearing this for the first time, and you say, well, okay, Michael, that's nice. What does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with me? Well, actually, if you're a follower of God, this has a lot to do with you. And I want to share with you just a few thoughts this morning in terms of application. And here's the first thought. Matthew's going to help me with these so that you can see them as well. All sin is an act against God, so He gets to define it. All sin is an act against God, so He gets to define it. Many have read or been exposed to this story, and one of the recurring responses is this: I don't quite get this. It wasn't that much gold. It was just a little gold. It was a little bit of silver, and it was a cloak. I mean, there were plenty of other precious metals coming into the treasury, and this cloak, it was going to be burned in the first place. So it's really just not that big a deal. Is this simply not much ado about nothing? Well, I'm not suggesting that that is an unreasonable response. I'm not suggesting that that is completely illogical. What I am suggesting today, though, is that it is entirely and completely wrong. It is entirely and completely wrong. It is wrong because it ignores this reality. Sin, by its very definition, is a transgression against, is an act of disobedience against God. When push comes to shove, every single sin, whether it specifically involves someone else or not, it all involves God because it's an act of disobedience against Him. And regardless of how we may seek to grade particular sins, it is all in the same category. It's an act of disobedience against God. Now, that by definition is what sin is. And that definition has a logical ramification. If, in fact, sin is an act of disobedience against God, the logical consequence of that follows that He, and He alone, determines what is and is not sin. Now, if it's an act against Him, doesn't it stand to reason that He gets to determine what is against Him? In fact, He alone gets to determine what is an act against Him. You say, well, Michael, I can buy that, but let me just underscore the fact that this is a principle that our current American society is having great struggles with. You're aware of that if you're paying attention. I mean, it's true not simply of American society, but of the societies and cultures throughout the world that over time, with the passage of time and the advance of history, what particular societies and culture deem as being right or wrong, as times pass, so too do those standards, don't they? Things that were understood to be wrong in time get redefined. They get reclassified. I mean, a good case in point is that January 1st, 2015, same-sex marriage was not a right in this country. September the 20th, 2015, because of the Supreme Court's decision this past summer, it is not only a legal right, but our society has effectively endorsed it and said, hey, that's okay. That's right. And what collectively we are witnessing is that society, whether it's American society, French society, you pick any culture, any society, collectively what we are witnessing is that societies and cultures operate on this principle. we get to determine what is right and what is wrong. Let me just say that God operates on a very different principle. He alone determines what is right and wrong. Because every sin, regardless of what it is, again, whether it impacts or it involves someone else or not, is an act of disobedience against Him. It therefore logically and of necessity follows that He alone gets to determine what is and is not sin. He gets to define it. That leads us to a second observation, a second layer of application, which is this: you can choose to sin but not determine its consequence. You can choose to sin but not determine its consequence. Again, regularly, if and when people are exposed to this story, whether they read it, they hear it in a Sunday school class, they hear a message about it, someone describes this account to them, regularly people will hear this. And again, their response is not illogical. It's not an unreasonable response, but the thought again is this: it was just a cloak, for goodness sake. It was just a little bit of silver. It was just a little bit of gold. Even if that gold and silver never found its way into the treasury, it's not like God's going bankrupt. I mean, the cloak was going to be burned to begin with. And yes, technically Achan should not have done this. It was an act of disobedience. And I suppose if push comes to shove, it should have been punished. But the punishment seems to be so at odds and so disparate with the act. Yeah, there should have been consequences, but the consequences should have been far, far less severe, far less consequential. Again, that's a reasonable thought. These consequences are awfully severe, aren't they? You do wrong, you get stoned and your body burned. That I can't imagine much more stern consequence. That's a reasonable thought. But though reasonable, it is still belying or underscored by a false notion. Again, the false notion regularly begins with the thought that we determine not simply what is right and what's wrong, but furthermore, we are also appropriate, and it is fitting for us not merely to assess what is wrong, but what's wrong and what's really wrong. That we are appropriate in deciding what's wrong and what's really wrong. Again, the thought that many would say is, yeah, he shouldn't have done this. In the scheme of things, that's wrong. But it's not like he killed anybody. There's no sexual deviancy at play here. He just took some stuff that he shouldn't have. And so, in terms of consequence, that should not have been the response. That should not have been what it is that he experienced. Well, again, that sounds reasonable, but it's nevertheless wrong. So let me state it clearly and simply. Not only is God alone the one who defines sin, He also, of necessity, alone determines its consequence. He alone determines its consequence. Sometimes those consequences are less severe. Sometimes, as was the case here, they are very severe. And going into the act, you will have no idea exactly what the consequences will be. But suffice it is to say this: those consequences are determined exclusively and solely by God Himself. That leads us to an inescapable application. Namely this: you can choose to sin. You're completely free to do that. God's not putting a gun to your head. Nobody else is either. You can choose to sin. You are absolutely free to do that. But what you are not free to do, what you are not at all appropriate in doing, what is absolutely not within your jurisdiction, is to determine what those consequences are. God determines what is and is not sin, and logically it follows that He alone determines the consequence. Well, based on what we see here, that leads us to a third layer of application, which is this: sin does not merely affect you. Sin does not merely affect you. In fact, you want to personalize that statement? You can say your sin does not merely affect you. My sin does not merely affect me. That's pretty easy to see in this passage, isn't it? Did Achan's wife steal any gold? Did his kids steal a cloak? Did his donkeys and mules go plunder and get some gold and silver? No. Achan did. In fact, it's not even clear from the text whether they had any idea that Achan had actually done this. Achan did this. But they sure experienced some consequences, didn't they? They lost everything. It's not simply that they lost their freedom or that they lost some stuff. They lost their very lives. They lost them in a terrible way. And not only was it when they were dead that it was finished, as an act of further humiliation, their bodies were burned. Pretty severe. It was Achan's sin, but it didn't just affect Achan. It affected his wife, his children, even all of his animals. There's another group that was clearly and directly impacted because of Achan's sin. Yeah, there were people that were friends of Achan that after this were grieving the loss of their friend or their cousin, their brother. But there were 36 other grieving families, weren't there? Families that should have not had to go and make funeral arrangements. 36 mothers that lost sons. 36 sisters that lost brothers. 36 sets of children that lost fathers that should not have died. When Israel went to fight Ai, this should have been an absolute rout of that city. Nobody on Israel's side should have died, but 36 of them did. Was that because they'd done anything wrong? No. Achan did. Achan did. Well, that reminds us of the very simple fact that my sin does not merely affect me and your sin does not merely affect you. God determines what is sin. He determines its consequence. And regularly, those consequences affect others. Oftentimes those that are dearest on earth to you. You say, I don't know if I buy that. Why don't you see if you can get on the phone and call Josh Duggar? I don't know if that name rings a bell to you, but TLC for years had a show that whether you watched it regularly or not at all, you're probably familiar with it. It was called 19 Kids and Counting, about Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar. They have 19 children, the oldest of which is Josh. Josh is a married father now of 4. After getting married and starting a family, he had just a couple of years ago, I guess, moved to Washington, D.C. to work with the Family Research Council, a Christian lobbying group there in Washington, trying to articulate on the behalf of evangelicals biblical morality, godly standards. Well, you're probably also familiar of something else that occurred this summer, and that was that the website Ashley Madison got hacked. And so this group of techies hacked into Ashley Madison servers. Ashley Madison is a website that exists for the singular purpose of enabling people to procure and to experience adulterous relationships. Their motto is very simple: life is short, have an affair. And so you log in with your credentials and you pay them to help match you up with other individuals with whom you might be able to cheat on your spouse with. Well, they hacked into Ashley Madison's servers, got the database of all their customers, and sure enough, Josh Duggar's name is on that list. It wasn't someone simply that even went out of curiosity to the website, but he was a paying customer. In fact, in the last year, he had paid in excess of $900, among other occasions, to have an affair while his wife is pregnant with their 4th child. Well, because of some events you might also be aware of that took place earlier in the summer relative to the disclosure of some transgressions he experienced as a teenager, TLC had already canceled 19 Kids and Counting. So it was already off the air when all of this came out. But this was Josh Duggar's sin. It wasn't his mom's, it wasn't his dad's, and it surely was not his wife's sin. But it sure affected some other people, didn't it? I mean, he's lost his job. Presently has no means of supporting his not-so-small family. This very day is sitting in a rehab unit seeking assistance to help overcome sexual addiction. Think of how his wife feels. She had trusted him implicitly and came to discover there was no reason to trust him at all. Think of what this has done to his children. Where's Daddy at? Think of the dilemma that puts Mom in to have to explain why Daddy's not coming home now. Think about Jim, Bob, and Michelle Duggar. I mean, this is a couple that has sacrificed in excess to invest in the lives of each of their children, to, as best they can, etch in stone godly and biblical values. I mean, the grief that they're experiencing over what he's going through has got to be palpable, but you got to think there's a part of them that's thinking, where did we mess up? What did we miss? Where did we screw up? So it affected them. That's easy to see. But you know what? It's affected a lot more people than that. I don't know how many of you have Facebook and you have some Facebook friends that don't share your walk with the Lord or your commitment to biblical values. If that's the case, you have probably seen more than a few postings over the course of this summer as individuals have been laughing it up about the disclosure of Josh Duggar's name on Ashley Madison. Here is somebody that had been put up as an example, someone that stands for biblical and godly and family values, and he is nothing more than a plain, simple hypocrite. That's what those evangelicals are. That's what those Christians are. Ha, 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 ha. How many people have laughed and scoffed at Christians as a whole because someone who supposedly represented Christ was such a colossal hypocrite? It hurt his wife. It hurt his children, his parents, and ultimately everyone who names the name of Christ. Why? Because his sin did not merely affect him. My sin does not merely affect you, and your sin does not merely affect you. That leads us to this final layer of application, which is this. Sin's presence in the individual affects the outcome for the many. Sin's presence in the individual affects the outcome for the many. This is easy to miss, but I want you to look at verse 11 of chapter 7. Remember what's going on here. Joshua has said to God, hey, what happened? Why did we lose this? What happened at Ai? It'd been better if we were sitting back in Egypt. And God responds, and what I want you to notice is God's use of plural pronouns. Plural pronouns. God says, Israel has sinned. Notice the plural pronoun, they. They have transgressed my covenant. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and they have lied and put them among their own belongings. You say, wait a minute, this was Achan's sin. They didn't sin, he sinned. They didn't steal, he stole. They didn't lie, he lied. They didn't bury, he buried. This was Achan's sin. But his individual sin had enormously collective consequence. It caused the people of which he was a part of collectively to be in a sinful state. That is why this not merely affected Achan. It wasn't Achan who lost the battle, it was Israel who lost the battle. What Achan did affected every single one of them. It became true of them as a people that they had sinned, they had transgressed, they had stolen, they had lied, they had covered up. Since they had sinned, they lost. Now, this thought has significant consequence for us as a fellowship of believers, individuals part of a larger collective body. It is a thought echoed in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Perhaps you remember Paul is addressing an issue that he became aware of that's going on in Corinth. He says this, "It's come to my attention that there is sin, immoral sin, sexual immoral sin that's present among you, among the Corinthian church, that's not even found among lost people." So within the church, there's sexual immorality they don't even see lost people doing. And then he says, this is what it is. There is a man having an incestuous affair with his own mother. Paul then tells them to do something very specific. Expel the immoral brother, and poses to them this hypothetical, rhetorical question. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? What was Paul saying? Paul was saying exactly what I believe we see here going on with Achan. Sin's presence in the individual affects the outcome for the many. Your individual sin and my individual sin affects and impacts the outcome for the whole. Can I just be honest with you this morning and say this? The extent to which God is able to work in and through this church is inextricably linked to the presence or absence of sin in the body. Let me say that again. The extent to which God is able to work in and through this church as a body is inextricably linked to sin's presence or its absence in the body. You say, Michael, do you really believe that? You bet I do. You bet I do. In case you haven't noticed anything else in this passage, if there's no other takeaway, there ought to be something that should just be glaring off of these words and from these pages to you. And you know what it is? God takes sin seriously. Very seriously. And you say, well, Michael, that's Old Testament stuff. That's Joshua stuff. And not simply is that Old Testament, it's even in the old part of the Old Testament. That's not even pushing it further down the line and approaching when Christ was going to come and the church was going to get established. This is Old Testament stuff. What does this have to do with me? Let me ask you this question. When, then, along the way, did God decide that sin was not a big deal? When did He decide that He could operate, would bless, would move in a mighty way when there is unconfessed, unrepentant sin? Can I answer that for you? He never did. He never did. Let me ask you then, do you want to have a front row seat? Do you want to see God move in this church family? Do you want us to be able to witness in our own community Jericho walls tumbling down? Do you want to see God use us to draw people to Him like has never been witnessed in the nearly 41 years of existence of Gate City Baptist? Do you want Him to bless this church like we could have never imagined? Well, there's that one little thing that's in the way. That one little thing that's not so little, that causes a big, really big difference. It's sin. It's sin in the way. Listen, I cannot do one blessed thing about your sin. You can't do anything about mine. But if collectively we as a group of individuals come clean before a holy God, we will see that holy God, through the power of His mighty Spirit, do exceedingly abundantly beyond anything we could ever ask or imagine. I'll leave you with two questions. Do you want to see that? And then, what in your life, what in your heart is in the way? Will you bow your heads with me? I want you to know that this message does not come to you today, collectively or individually, because of some particular knowledge I've got about what's in your closet, what skeletons are lurking. But I just really believe that anytime you've got a significantly numerous group of people together, even among those that are professing to be followers of God, there are individuals that are hiding things. They wouldn't want anybody else to know. And maybe nobody else on earth does. Perhaps you came into this place and you've been singing the songs. You answered the questions in Sunday school. You've got a Bible with your name on it. But there would be people who would be aghast, shocked if they knew what you've been spending your time looking on the internet at this week. There are people who would be shocked if they knew sexual decisions that you have been making. There would be people who would be shocked to know the things that you have said. People galled if they knew the manner in which you have been living away from this group. Listen, I'm not asking you or anybody else to come up here and stand at a microphone and say, "Attention, everyone, this is what I have done." I'm just asking you to go to the one that your sin ultimately affects, that your sin ultimately transgressed, and that's God Himself. He identified it. He's showing you in your own heart what it is. And before He can do anything in this church, He's got to do something in the hearts of people individually. They've got to be clean. I want you to understand that what's going on in your heart affects what God is able to do in this fellowship. Maybe you have said, and perhaps it is entirely true, you want to see God move in a mighty way in this church. Perhaps it's also true that God, through the power of His Spirit, has shown you there are things in your heart that are personally a roadblock to that. Will you just come clean before Him today? In fact, Karen is playing this morning. I know a praise team is in place, but I'm just going to ask Karen if she would to play softly this morning, because I don't want anything to be a distraction from you this morning. Maybe you feel the Spirit of God talking and burdening your heart this morning. He's shining the light on things that nobody else knows about. And it's time to just come clean before Him. Even as I speak, perhaps you just need to kneel at this altar. Will you begin to move? Will you begin to have that honest confession, that honest conversation with the Lord? Lord, I believe sincerely that as you did in the day of Joshua, you wanted to do significant things among your people. It was true for the nation of Israel. It's true for the church collectively. It's true for this church. Lord, I believe one of the things that has not changed are your ground rules. That you work with that which is clean. Period. Lord, as you are speaking to hearts in ways that I never could, I pray, God, that you give people the courage to respond. I pray, God, that collectively, we as a church, as a family of individuals, we come clean before you and begin to witness and observe you do exceedingly abundantly beyond anything we could ever ask or imagine. Lord, there perhaps are other decisions that you're calling people to make. Maybe for some, this is the day they know that you're leading them to unite with this church. Maybe for others, it's to begin a relationship with you or find out how that is the case. God, for any decision that you're calling us to make, I pray that we will make it. For those that need the courage to step out, I pray that they'll find it in you. I pray, God, that you will work during this time of decision and that we will respond. We ask this of you in Christ's name. Amen. I'm going to just ask if you would just to keep your heads bowed and your eyes closed for just a moment or two longer. Karen's going to play, and if God is speaking to your heart, will you just respond? You want somebody to pray with you? I'll be glad to. You just need to come and talk to him. You seize this opportunity.